There we go. Recording is in progress. So thank you again for joining us. Lori Guenther Reesor is a faith fundraising specialist, and I just love that title. Through her educational pursuits, including a Bachelor of Maths, Master of Theological Studies, and a Doctorate of Ministry, and her professional experience, which includes consulting with many different churches and denominations across Canada. Lori is a writer. And I'm delighted that she has written such a wonderful resource called Growing a Generous Church, A Year in the Life of Peach Blossom Church. And I encourage everyone here, if you haven't had an opportunity yet, to pick that book up. I'm so grateful Lori could join us today and share with us on how to create a generosity plan and to give us an opportunity to think that through and how that can take place in our lives. So Lori, thank you so much for joining us, and away we go with our presentation.
All right, thank you very much, Jillian. I'm so glad to be here. Creating a generosity plan. So yes, I am Lori Guenther Reesor. A quick shout out to someone who typed in that they were from Treaty 6 in Saskatchewan. As a Mennonite person, my grandparents and parents are Mennonite settlers, white settlers from that area. And yes, it's September 28th, 2021. It's always good to just remember these important things, isn't it? I think so. So this webinar is brought to you, as was introduced, by the Anglican Diocese of Niagara, by the Anglican Diocese of Ottawa, and by LFAC. And I'm grateful. And one of the things I like about stewardship, and I like a lot of things about stewardship, is that it's ecumenical, and there's all of us different folks working together. And it just seems like a really kingdom thing to me. So I'm grateful. I think Jillian has already said most of these things about me. One of my taglines is, Jesus talks about money, we can too. And I have 2 young adult kids, so I often say that I'm interruptible. I haven't had an uninterrupted thought in decades. So there'll be places throughout this presentation for you to type in your questions, and then I'll just ask Jane, hey, are there any questions? And she'll read them out. So if you have something, please ask me. I might have said this before and it might make perfect sense to me, but maybe I've missed something. So please don't hesitate to ask. There's no such thing as a silly question. I scribbled on here that I should say Mennonite. I think I said that already. I'm a home canner. Just finished salsa last week and it's a little bit spicy for my poor delicate palate, but I'll be all right. And applesauce is coming up this week. And I'm a quilter. I can't take credit for the one behind me. That's made by people more skilled than me. And as Jillian said, this year I self-published my book, Growing a Generous Church, A Year in the Life of Peach Blossom Church. I've written academic theses about giving, which frankly aren't that easy to read. But this is me wanting to be a good steward of the stories that have been shared with me. I was, for my doctoral research, I spent a lot of time drinking coffee in church basements and listening to people's stories. And this book is intended to be easy to read, and it's a story. It's a year in the life of that church. So it's available through my website. It's available through Common Word Bookstore, which is in Winnipeg, but also ships. And it's perfect for a parish book study or a church book study because there's discussion questions right in the book. They're included. The goal is to make it easy for you to be able to talk about money in your church. Going back to my tagline, Jesus talks about money, we can too. All right, creating a generosity plan. We start with the obvious because we have to be reminded of the obvious. Children of a generous God have gifts to share. That's just true. That's because of God's goodness. We inherently have that seed of generosity in us. It needs some nurturing and cultivation, but children of a generous God have gifts to share. Giving is a spiritual discipline like prayer. It's a discipleship question. It's not a budget question. It's not a means to a ministry end. Generosity, the spiritual discipline of giving, it's the thing. It's part of our following Jesus. And again, this is something that we need to keep reminding ourselves over and over again. In the book, I talk about the left hand, right hand, and I won't go into it now, but just to say, when Jesus talks about giving and he talks about prayer, and he talks about fasting in that story. They're all together. So they're all part of how we follow Jesus together. So what seeds do we have to plant? It seems to me that's what we think about when we think about a generosity plan. What do we have? I remind myself that nothing grows when it's clenched in our tight little fists or hidden under our mattress. When we open our palms, when we share, when we put those seeds into the dirt, that's how things grow. It's a miracle and a mystery, but that's how life works. That's how these seeds grow. As Jillian said, I did my master's and then my doctorate. And in both cases, I spent a lot of time with 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. And when I'm hoping that in the great beyond, in eternity, that I'll be able to ask Apostle Paul some questions about that. But in the meantime, I read a lot of what other people have written. This is based on the work of James Dunn. And it's a circle of grace. And it's talking about how everything comes from God and how people share. This is a page from my book. You can read that. You'll have the PDF, so you can read that. But I really like this one with the peach. The designer did a great job. It's a peach blossom church, so the circle of grace has a peach. But for our discussion now, I'm going to go back to something that's easier to read on the screen. So the circle of grace starts with God. God, the giver of every good thing. And by God's grace, which is new every morning, we are here, despite all the things that might trouble us and worry us and the burdens we are carrying. God's grace is what's got us to this point. I think if I was preaching, I might ask everyone to say amen, but it's fine. You can just nod. And we as God's children receive this grace. And as God's children, we share with what we've received with gracious action with other people. And we're not just the givers, we're the receivers of all kinds of gracious action. So we're both givers and receivers in this model. And we respond to the gift of this day, to the gift of Jesus, to the gift of kindness of other people with praise and thanksgiving to God. And God continues to be generous to us. And it's just a beautiful circle of grace. That's the model. In the church, however, despite the fact that we have this really rich theology of giving, I mean, we don't have to copy the Cancer Society to learn how to fundraise. We have this as part of our discipleship, part of how God has created us. In the church, however, we often reduce stewardship to people giving to budget, just to the red lines I've shown you here. What can I say except that it pains me so, because we could be talking about God's grace and God's generosity to us, and how when we share how people's lives are changed, how our lives are changed from being grateful receivers. So the more we can talk about generosity as a spiritual discipline and in response to God's grace to us, and the less we can talk. I mean, yes, we have budgets. I'm not saying we get rid of them, but boy, we have better ways of talking about giving than the budget. All right. If you have any questions, please go ahead and type them in, and we'll get Jane to read them out. I'm not good enough multitasker to be able to do all those things. Any questions? Okay, so either I'm talking too fast or I'm just crystal clear. Well, it could be a bit of both. So a generosity plan, I think, would start with prayer. In fact, I think if we could just pray this one together. Lord, help me, help us to be generous. Could you imagine if you had a generosity buddy and you just prayed that prayer for a week or a month, or I guess 40 days would be a good biblical number, but I'm not going to be legalistic about this one here. But we're wanting God to do the heavy lifting here, which is, I mean, it's kind of silly to think that we would be able to handle it, but we're wanting God to work in us and help us be generous. If we rely on what we've got, well, that's not a lot. So creating a generosity plan. What seeds do we have to plant? What has God given me? Now we're going to be looking beyond just our bank account here, although I am going to talk a lot about the bank account side of things, just because that's the hardest part for us to talk about. So it's not, I don't want to you to think that we aren't generous with everything that God has entrusted to us, but we're going to focus a little bit on the bank account side of things. We're going to look at our neighbors, who our neighbors are, and how we can live generously. So what has God given me or us? And this, my friends, is not a complete list. And I also want to say that I know that there's pains and sorrows that we're carrying too. I don't want this gratitude to sort of be like, oh, we can only, like, sort of a toxic positivity. I think that's a Kate Bowler thing. But when we look at realistically at what God has given us, we have to look at it all. And when we look honestly, there's a lot of gifts: life, breath, salvation, the gift of other people. And I would definitely consider the privilege of looking out at a sea of faces in Zoom to be part of that. To be grateful for the church, for our education, for our health. And I know that these things aren't all evenly distributed. Education and health and all sorts of things. And so how can our generosity be a way of helping these things to be evenly distributed? The story that I like to use for this is the story of manna, and Paul, when he's writing in Corinthians, uses it too. Some gathered little and some gathered much. And when we share, there is enough. When we share, there is enough. So we have time, we have money, we have energy, and I know for sure that these things aren't evenly distributed. We have opportunity. And there's the things that God gives, which God gives lavishly on the righteous and the unrighteous. Grace, mercy, joy, so many other things. God is a very generous giver, and I'm grateful. I emphasize about what God has given us and receiving that with gratitude, because gratitude is the gateway drug to generosity. That depends on my audience whether I use that line or not. But it really, gratitude is such a foundational practice in our Christian walk. And I emphasize that again, because if you see the big red X in this model, it's very, very easy to just think, oh, all mine. I earned it, I deserved it, it's mine. And when we think about things that way, then we hold on very tight and we don't share. When it's God's stuff, when we're trusting God, then we can share. I know this might seem very obvious and something that we would explain to an 8-year-old, but I find that that's how I understand it. And I have to keep reminding myself, because there's so many voices in our culture and our society that are saying it's mine. I earned it, my stuff. And when people ask me, well, how would I start? How would I be generous? This isn't something that I learned. Many people have learned it from watching other people and someone in their family. Sometimes it's a boss. Sometimes they learned it on their own. But how would you start being generous? And this is paraphrased from Darren Priest-Clausen, who's from a CEO of Abundance Canada. And he says, choose an amount you can afford, give regularly, choose a cause that you care about, give regularly, and see where it takes you. And again, it's trusting God to in that journey of generosity, that God will use us and use our gifts. And sometimes we also say, or I've heard it said, well, we don't. What about like people who don't have much money? And there certainly are people that if you can't pay the rent, then this advice isn't for you necessarily. But even if you're a student, you probably have the choice between a Tim Hortons and a Starbucks, or you have some kind of choices that you could make, and money that you could give, that you could get started. It's like prayer. We wouldn't say to someone, oh, well, you know what? You can learn to pray when you're older. When you're retired, you'll have lots of time. So why don't you just start praying then? We wouldn't say that. We would say, oh, Well, yeah, you might not be able to pray as much as the nuns, but you can pray with your kids before they go to bed. And you can pray waiting in line at the grocery store. I've started doing that, which is a really interesting spiritual practice. So it's praying as you're able, it's giving as you're able. Not all of us are going to be able to pray as much or give as much, but when we all do those things together, my, oh my, what things can happen. Okay, are there any questions? Okay, I'm moving my slides up. If you're following sort of the theme, they start with spring and then they move to summer, then fall, then winter, so that you have a sense of where we're going. Summer is my ideal season. So I put, when we're talking about ideal time, I chose this and I said, don't wait for the ideal time to start being generous. Now is good. And you might think of, oh, well, once I have more, again, like the example, the story I just shared about prayer, we wouldn't say, oh, wait until you're old to learn how to pray. And what about young families? Young families where the cost of housing is really high. They might not be able to give in the same way as a baby boomer who doesn't have a mortgage. But now is the time to learn good habits. People who, I've talked to a lot of generous people, and people who are generous with much were once generous with little. And so I encourage us all to give. There's a power to it when the church is giving to a project and we're able to say, you know what, if we're giving it to, say, a refugee family, if we're able to say to that family, everyone in our church, little kids had lemonade stands, and older people were able to give out of, by putting money away, and families were, decided not to get pizza that night. And all together we shared and we're helping you. I don't know what the word is for that, but there is a movement of the Spirit, a power of the church working together. That's something very powerful. It's like when we pray together. Why do we do that? Everyone could just pray at home. But when we pray together, and we do both. It's not one or the other. We'll do individual giving a bit. And when we give together, there's power in that. We pray on our own. And when we pray together as a congregation, there's power in that. So I'm a huge fan of generosity. I don't know how to explain it better than that. So now is a good time to start. Don't wait until your situation is somehow going to improve to some magic state. That said, if you've got $40,000 in debt, now is also a good time to seek help. And I'm particularly conscious of pastors and clergy who've graduated with huge amounts of debt and aren't well paid. And then they're put in this awful position of feeling like, what do I say about stewardship? So if you are struggling, we can talk about hard things. We can. Now is a good time to seek help. Credit Counseling Canada, talk to Jillian, talk to Jane, talk to Catherine. They would be able to point you in a good direction. One good direction is Credit Counseling Canada. It's a nonprofit and they can help get things in order. One thing is for sure, silence and secrecy around money doesn't help. It doesn't help in the church. It doesn't help when we're in trouble. It doesn't help when we have money either, because then the money can be really still having a very tight grip on us too. So now is the time to start being generous. And now is also the time to look at, have a loving and honest and truthful look at what our finances are, if that's what we need to do. I gave gratitude its own slide here because I just can't say it enough. To be grateful for what God has given us and to be grateful for the people in our church. And to thank people is really important too. That seems obvious perhaps, but to thank people for the generosity that they share. It's really quite extraordinary. If you look at the numbers of what a typical Canadian gives, I'm assuming that they give, and it's only about half of Canadians who do that. When you look at the average, if you look at someone who's putting in $20 into the offering every week, that's $1,000 a year, which is way more than what Canadians typically give. So just recognizing with gratitude the generosity of people in our congregations, the people who have built our congregations to this point. There's lots of things to be grateful for. You who are gift planners will know this already, but people who plan more give more. So there are people who plan their giving a year in advance, and they certainly give more than people who wait to see what's left over. I think our churches can be good role models here. Do we give to our diocese or denomination or whatever name our national church has in our context? Do we wait to see how much money is left and then share, or do we share with them on a regular basis? Are we being good role models in the church? I think that's an important question to consider. So people who plan more give more, and I encourage churches to have pre-authorized giving, to have online giving, to have lots of ways to make it easy for people to give. And since COVID, churches have been a lot more receptive. Apparently we couldn't do it before, but all of a sudden like, oh, maybe we can. So I'm glad for that. If your income fluctuates, pick a small amount that you know you can give regularly. And if you have more money at one time, then you can write a check as well, or you can send you make an extra donation. There's no problem with giving more than one way, more than once. I was inspired by talking to Catherine and Jillian and Jane last week as we were preparing for this and talking about what if our money followed our prayers. Those of you who are Lutherans and Anglicans, you have this wonderful cycle of prayer that you're part of your liturgy every week is praying for your fellow Christians in other places and all around the world. And that's what when you give money to the church, like to beyond the parish, but you have an opportunity for your money to follow your prayer. So it's just, it's there. You have the structure in place for those prayers and the offering. It's an opportunity for your money to follow your prayers, for our money to follow our prayers, not just in worship, but thinking about things that concern us. Creating a generosity plan. So looking at what God has given me and looking about giving, and then where does that go? I've talked about giving it to the church and to the church with a capital C, perhaps. Thinking about causes that are important to you. I was inspired, I guess it was July now, by the Presbytery. So the Presbyterians of the Presbytery of Milwaukee. Someone gave a donation that they divided up among the parishes. I think there was about 24 parishes, and they all followed Matthew 25 in their giving. They interpreted it different ways. They had different emphasis, but they talked about, in this parish, we gave it to the food bank. In this parish, we helped the homeless. We helped people get clothes for interviews so they could get a job. In this parish, we were giving money so people could pay their bail and visiting people in prison. You can check out the blog post. I was really inspired by the list of causes that were all different, yet they were all, the focus was the same about, how can we help our neighbors? How can we love like Jesus instructed us to love? And I'd be curious if you wanted to type in the chat, if someone asked you right now, how can I help my neighbor in wherever you are, Guelph or Ottawa? What would you tell them? Would you tell them about a program in your church? Is there something that really inspires you in your neighborhood? And I invite you to type that in just as a way of reminding yourself, hey, this is where I see God at work in my neighborhood. Okay. So creating a generosity plan is thinking about gratefully what God has given us, our time and our talents and our energy. Looking beyond our bank account, although let's face it, we should be looking at our bank accounts too. Thinking about who our neighbors are. And I like Matthew 25 as a way of just really grounding us in who our neighbors can be. And then looking about living generously, praying with gratitude, looking around with compassion and acting with loving kindness. And I don't have all the chat, but maybe Jane, are there any questions?
So yes, I do have a few comments and questions, I guess. So the first comment is from Jillian Doucette Campbell, and it's she's saying she likes the idea of giving financially being similar to prayer. So starting where you're at. And then I have from Tom Mason, and this is a question. You connect grace with giving. So that's a question for you, Lori.
Yes, it's going back to, I don't know how much New Testament, I don't speak Greek. I wish I did. I mean, New Testament Greek, although I guess conversational Greek would be fun too. But it's going back to the word charis in the 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, and talking literally about engraced as a verb, as when we Christ, like talking about Jesus has engraced us as a gift. So if you look at that passage, I'm going to have to send you to my website, to my thesis, to really dig in, because it's James Donn and it's looking at all the nouns. But it's when this in that circle of grace model that I shared with you earlier, there's words, Greek words that are related to grace in all of those places in that passage, talking about how Jesus is grace embodied, and how giving is grace to others, and then praise. So I'm not really explaining it well because it's hard without like a whiteboard and all of those things, but it's embedded in the text and in the understanding of 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 that Jesus is grace and Jesus gifted us. And when the Apostle Paul is talking, it's about his collection for Jerusalem. He's talking about, you may or may not be familiar with this, but Paul is writing to the church in Corinth and the church in Macedonia, other places, and he's actually sending people around. They are collecting money, and then this big delegation of people travels with the money to Jerusalem. I talk about it being joyfully inefficient, and it is, because it's testimony. They are explaining why they're doing this project. So there's like a preacher along. They're very careful about counting the money because they want to make sure that in the eyes of God and the eyes of men that they're doing the right thing. So there's this whole really quite well-developed theology of sharing, of pooling, of sharing our resources and sharing them with those in need. And Paul says, hey, it's not because we owe them or they owe us, because I mean, okay, Lori, we're not doing like a 2-day workshop on a collection for Jerusalem. I wish we were, that would be cool. But if you want to read more, it's on my website under writings, I think academic writings. Do you get the sense I could talk about this all day? Yeah. So maybe I'll just pull myself in on that one. But yeah, it's 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 and grace and the word charis.
So thanks, Lori. Here's another comment. You talked about the importance of planning, and Laurette is commenting that if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And then you also were talking about ways of making it easier for people to give, and Pam Middleton is suggesting that e-transfer is also a great option. And then there are a few other, you had asked the question about, giving to our neighbors, who would we identify for generosity, for our own generosity to give to them. So Gail Turnbull replied community housing. Catherine Smith replied Guelph, the Silver Creek Market. Aaron replied that getting involved in volunteering is a way of being generous. Rob Towler is suggesting the community care program. There are quite a few here. So Monica Johnson commented that there's no shortage of needs. I would suggest someone start with what's close to their heart.
And it's wonderful to think that when we pray for the homeless, say perhaps that's really on our heart, then we have an opportunity for our money to follow our prayers. And the more we can tell stories in church of how our congregation is meeting the needs in our neighborhood and in our congregation, the better. To say that we thank God that when we give money to St. Matthew's, that we know that we are helping the people, isolated people among us, to get visits, or that communion is being served at whatever setting, or just all the little pastoral things that we might think of as small. These are visiting the least of these. This is grace in action too. I mean, the ministry just doesn't take place when we beyond our walls. Tell the stories of the ministry that takes place within as well. Okay, this is a winter picture, and a rather nice one too. I want to talk about one final act of kindness, and that would be legacy giving. Christians believe in eternal life, but we know that we're mortal. And yet, I know Jillian has said that someone commented that it was ghoulish to talk about death and talk about leaving a will as if Christians couldn't talk about death. So let's talk about hard things, shall we? And it's still Willpower Month because it's still September. So there's all kinds of really terrific resources out there on making a will and how that all happens. And I'll go back to the circle of grace again and remind us that God gives us life and breath. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. And God gives us life, and we don't know how long that's going to be, but for as long as we draw breath, we have an opportunity to be generous and to be gracious and to sing God's praises. And when we're done on this mortal coil, when we die, we still have another opportunity to be generous and to not in our dying sing God's praises. And that's by leaving a gift to our neighbors, to causes we care about, to the church. And I wanted to tell you a story. Actually, I think I wanted to mention one thing is that when people do leave a gift to your church, do you say thank you? If Jared, the grandson, leaves a memorial gift in grandma's honor at the funeral, do you say thank you? Or does he just get like a receipt in February like everybody else? And the reason I ask that is because that might be the only time Jared sets foot in a church, and a thank you letter to Jared is a ministry opportunity. It's an opportunity for Christian Witness to say thank you. We valued your grandma here, and we're so thankful that you made a gift in her honor. So I wanted to do that as a reminder that all these small, seemingly small gifts, or even almost transactions, are ministry opportunities that God has given us. Okay, and so a gift in a will is also an opportunity that God gives each of us, regardless of how much or how little we have. And I want to tell you a story. It's about my friend. I'll call her Mary. My friend Mary has passed away. It's been several years now. Mary lived on a pension. She wasn't super well. She, especially in the last couple of years, she used a cane to get around. She was a dedicated volunteer. Oh, she was. Oh, she had such a heart for the least of these prisoners, people on the street. Big, big heart. She loved kids. She loved to tell stories. And I I think I like telling this story so much because I just miss her. So Mary passed away, and it was unexpected. And she left a bequest to the church. We didn't expect it. I mean, Mary shopped at the thrift store. I'm getting emotional just thinking about it, and I've told this story before. So Mary left a gift to our church. And so what we did is we divided it. We left most of it. We shared most of it with the causes that Mary volunteered with in her honor, as a reminder of the good work that she did. So I guess in that sense, the money was following our prayers and her volunteer actions. So that's where most of the money went. About a third of the money, roughly, we kept. And what we did in our church, and of course, actual mileage will vary, but I want to tell you this story just as an illustration of joy rather than of a how-to, is we set up a fund to give scholarships. Well, I think it's more like camperships. We give money to kids to go to camp. If you're a kid in our church and you would like to go to Christian camp, we would like you to give you some money. I'm on the committee for this, and it is the best committee I have ever been on, because you know what people do? They say, can I send my kid to camp? And I say, yes, here is some money. Please send your kid to a Christian camp. And I know for sure, I mean, I can't start telling personal stories here, but I know for sure that there are kids who went to camp because of this. They wouldn't have been able to go otherwise. And that also means that there's Christian counselors who had a bit of a summer job and got to practice telling their Christian stories. So kids got to go to camp, older kids got to be counselors. And it encouraged families. This to me is just joy upon joy upon joy. And I would love to be able to do something like this in my will. I mean, it doesn't have to be this exact thing. And I would encourage you, in fact, when you're leaving a gift in your will, not to put any strings on it. Because if you leave, you say, oh, the church could really use new choir robes, but actually they need a drum kit. It's very difficult to change stuff like that. So leave an undesignated gift. Trust your congregation to sort out the details. But I can't think of why someone wouldn't want to do something like that, to just so that God can be thanked, so that there's an opportunity for you to be remembered joyfully. I mean, to me, there's also all the tax things, but that's important too. Mary's family would have got, her beneficiaries, her kids would have got the tax receipt based on the charitable gift that she made. But I don't think that's that's a nice bonus, but I don't think that's what motivated Mary at all. Are there any questions?
So yes, a few questions and comments. Just going back to sharing with our neighbors, being generous. Debbie Callender noted that your neighbor might be in another country. I support a young man I met in Malawi, Africa. So I'm sure there's a lovely story behind that, Debbie. Thank you for sharing that. And then just, going back to, wills and bequests, legacy giving. Jillian Doucette Campbell has shared the link to Willpower, and I would encourage you to go and to make note of that and check it out. Any comments on that, Lori, on those comments?
I think I would encourage the story of the woman who has a friend in Malawi. That would be the more we can tell these stories, the better. Sometimes we're far too shy about, we think it's kind of braggy or something, but it's really, I would say it's more of I thank God for the opportunity to help my friend in Malawi. It's a real blessing for me to connect with him, and I am so grateful, not as woohoo, look at me, I'm great, because I'm sure that's not the intent. But the more we can talk about our generosity, that's how people learn. When I've had the opportunity and the extreme privilege of listening to people tell me how they learned to be generous. And especially older people will say, I remember my dad got paid in cash. And Thursday night, he would cash his check and there would be piles of cash. And he would count out one pile of money for the church, one pile of money for the groceries. And then we lived on what was left, and every week without fail. And so people who learned like that, by the time they were 5 or 6, they knew generosity really well. And I think the church assumes, like, so back in the day, if you saw your dad counting out those piles of cash, you saw your mom helping neighbors in very tangible ways, the church assumed that everyone got the generosity memo, and we didn't really talk about it too much. However, very, very few people get paid in cash anymore. And we cannot assume that people have learned how to be generous at home. And so it's so important for the church to tell stories of generosity so that we can exercise our generosity muscles, so that we can learn. Just like prayer, we start with books of prayer. We have picture books for kids explaining how to pray. We often have special children's features in the church or whatever. The same for generosity. We really have to be telling all those stories of how we learn to be generous and what happens when we give money to the church, because people do not know. So the more you can tell stories, the better. And the more you can say thank you, the better too. Now, I don't even remember what got me onto that tangent, but that's where that's where I landed.
Just a few other comments, Lori, mainly about expressing thanks. So Pastor Brian is saying, what would be ideal would be a handwritten thank you letter. And I'll just read out the comments. Wanda Robinson, she's saying a thank you letter is great, but also explaining, it's important to explain where the gift was used. And then Monica Johnson is saying, Lori is so right. Our culture is afraid to talk about money, but talking and telling stories is how we learn. And I'm just checking to see if there's anything more. Did you have any comments about those comments, Lori?
Yeah, thank you letters are lovely. I'm aware that there's a bit of a cultural, like that is the sort of the gold standard in fundraising, but I'm aware that there's a bit of a cultural stuff going on that I'm learning there, that's a very white thing. So it might not be, depending on your context, it might not be, there's lots of other ways to say thank you too. I love a card, and that certainly, I keep them, in fact. It's also great to pick up the phone and talk to people. Like I trust pastors and clergy and church leaders to know their context and to know what the best and most appropriate way to say thank you is going to be. And saying thank you in worship too, and say, like, sometimes I get pushback by people saying that, we shouldn't thank people, that it's sort of a duty and obligation thing. And if you start reading the New Testament, wow, I mean, especially Paul, he's my go-to, but I thank God for your generosity. Like that's strong, isn't it? I mean, we're almost more afraid to say, I thank God for your generosity, than we are to say thank you to people directly. But yeah, we can pull that right out of scripture. So there's a real, we have so many opportunities to say thank you, and to be thank you for God, to be thankful for people's generosity is, I mean, we say thank you when people pray for us. We're totally fine with that. So I think we can be thankful for people's financial generosity too.
So are there any other comments or questions for Lori? Just type them into the chat. Thank you.
Okay, I'll put this slide in again. You can check out my website, which the link is there if you'd like to know more about my book, including a nice review from Jillian, so thank you. As a small business with Canada Post, I have 3 free shipments in the month of October. So that's a single, like a shipment, like a parcel. So it has to be more than one book for me to use that. But if you would like to order books in October, I have 3 free shipments, and I offer a discount if you're ordering 10 books. So if you'd like to start a book club, I want you to, I want to make it easy for people to do that, is what I'm saying. Okay, what else do we got?
So Lori, there's another comment here. It's from Wendy Newman. And it's saying, Wendy is saying, at our meeting last night, our stewardship group renamed ourselves. We are now the generosity team. It was one of those spontaneous things when we were confirming our fall 2021 plan.
Oh, that's so nice. Thanks for that, Wendy. I'm really pleased to hear that. I mean, stewardship is a good word too, but generosity sounds more fun. And so I wish you every blessing as the generosity team. I hope it's a joyful team.
Yeah, and also just to note that Jillian Doucette Campbell has sent out the link to find out more about Lori's book and to sign up for her blog. So that's something to take note of. Then Barbara is commenting, in my Anglican journey hasn't talked about everything, the everything comes from God idea. Do you have an entry point into this conversation?
Oh, an entry point into this conversation. Christian View of Money by Mark Vincent is a good one. More with Less cookbook is a Mennonite classic that is really grounded in gratitude and being a good steward of what God gives you. So that, I mean, that might sound like a left field one, but it's a cookbook filled with stories of people, of why they cook the way they do, why they are careful when they cook rice, because they're thinking of people who don't have rice. So that's I know that might sound odd, but it's not a bad one. Where you would start by thinking that everything is from God. Diana Butler Bass, Gratitude. It's a good one too. She's writing from Washington, D.C. in the first year of Trump's presidency, if that gives you some context. So depending on where you're at, what would be a meaningful book? From a Catholic perspective, Imagining Abundance, although that's specifically written as from a fundraising perspective, like she's actually a fundraiser. That's her name's escaping me, but I know the book is called Imagining Abundance. Does that help? Jillian looks like she's going to unmute and she has got something to add.
Sorry, I was just going to say I'm going to put those in the link. I'm trying to keep up with your with your suggestions so that you can see them, and if you want to click on them and save them for later to maybe order or think about getting. And yeah, I've read all of the suggestions as well and cooked with the cookbook, and I highly recommend them too.
Yeah, just a comment from Catherine Smith saying that she loves the cookbook. It changed me as well when I was in university, and so she's recommending definitely to check out More with Less cookbook. And then there are a couple of thank yous here from Barbara, and then also Lorette is saying thank you.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah, you know, when I started writing this book, like, this book has got maybe 25% of what I wrote in there. The first thing I sent to an editor, it did have recipes because that seemed to me that was important, but I had like recipes and poems and blog posts and stories about peach blossom. And so this version just has the stories about peach blossom more or less. Although I made sure that in peach blossom, they use my husband's butter tart recipe. So maybe there's some Mennonite in there. Thank you so much, everyone. I really value that I feel like this is a discussion. It's not a one-way train. I wanted to make sure that you had contact information for the very talented resource people that have organized this, for Jillian and Jane and Catherine. they're the people that can help point you in the direction of, okay, well, how can I be more intentional about this? And maybe how can you be more intentional in ways that are more technical kinds of giving, like stocks, gifts of stocks. We should do a whole, maybe you have one coming up, like that could be a whole thing. Life insurance, bequests and wills. I mean, there's a lot of ways to be generous. And so, yeah, and the more we can talk about these hard things now, do your giving while you're living so you're knowing where it's going, that sort of thing. That I'm afraid I can't remember who wrote that. It's not me. But yeah, the more we can plan our generosity, the more faithful we can be. It's just like discipleship is a discipline, right? And so generosity requires a bit of discipline too.
Thank you so much, Lori. And more thank yous are coming in. I just want to take this moment to thank you for your time and for the resources you suggested, and also your example of a giver who gave through their will. That is a remarkable story. And I'm sure many of us here have or know of people in our lives who have given and it's an example to us in our own generosity. I also want to say thank you for mentioning the Credit Counseling Canada opportunity if you're worried about debt or concerned that there are resources to help. And also thank you for reminding us that giving is like prayer. And we need to exercise our muscles in prayer as well as in giving and generosity. I also appreciate that we're being reminded that not everyone got the generosity memo, and that we need to be talking about generosity. We can't assume that people know how to do that. That's why when we walk into an Indigo or other bookstores, we often see gratitude journals or ways to be grateful, to remind us, especially when we're living in a time right now where scarcity is easy to cling to. It's a good way to practice combating that scarcity mindset by reminding that we have enough and to be grateful for what we have. So thank you so much, Lori, for your time today. We will be sending out the recording to this, and we ask that you not share it through social media or on websites. That would be really great. And I just want to say thank you for your time, everyone. And we look forward to inviting you back for another opportunity. As Lori alluded to, we do have some upcoming events. October 26th, we'll be talking about gifts of shares or publicly traded securities. And then later in November, we'll be talking about bequests and financial planning. So look for those events on your diocesan websites, or we'll also be posting them through however you found today's event. You'll find them through that as well, and you can register to attend those. So thank you, everyone. And please take down the information to reach out to any one of us. We'd be happy to answer any questions you have. So take care.